Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for the 7th seminar in our 10th anniversary conversation series, asking 10 big questions on deliberative democracy. My name is Jordan McSweeney. I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy at the University of Canberra. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which the University of Canberra's Bruce campus is located, the Ngunnawal people. These are sovereign lands that were never ceded, and I pay respects to Ngunnawal elders past and present, and respects I extend to any other First Nations people joining us today. So today we're joined for our conversation on how can deliberative democracy respond to macho populism by our very own Dr. Hans Asenbaum, a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. And also, we're waiting on our colleague, María Esperanza Casullo, who is an Associate Professor at the National University of Rio Negro and a researcher at CONICET in Argentina. So the format for today is opening statements of approximately 5 minutes by both of our speakers. We'll then invite reflections from our speakers and a question to each other in the hopes Maria will join us in time to get the conversation started. The last 25 minutes or so we'll hold open for Q&A, and I'd encourage you to get your questions ready during the discussion. You're welcome to use the chat as the conversation is ongoing to start queuing the questions there. And just a reminder as well that this meeting is being recorded. So with that, Hans, I'll throw it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jordan, and thank you everybody who was involved in organizing this. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. Sorry I cannot be there in person. I'm currently on a research visit in Brazil, but I'm really excited to have this conversation about macho populism, which I think is such an important topic because it combines two issues that I think are so important today. On the one hand, the question of populism, what's happening in our political systems today, and the question of gender identity, and here in particular, the question of masculinities. So how can deliberative democracy challenge macho populism? Well, maybe to start with macho populism, and I'll talk from the perspective of masculinity studies, draw on masculinity studies, and then move on to deliberative democracy and ask how can deliberative democracy then respond to this phenomenon of macho populism. So what is macho populism? It's closely connected, I think, to the concept of hypermasculinity, right? So it's a very masculine version of populism. But of course, assuming that just by saying hypermasculinity, an exaggerated version of masculinity, we assume that we know what masculinity is. And of course, we're moving here in the heterosexual matrix of assuming that by masculinity, we mean cisgender, heterosexual masculinity. The term macho emerging in the 1940s or so in Latin America, so quite recent, right? It's a recent idea, macho in itself as well, was originally used in a positive sense to speak about men or masculinities who featured typical heterosexual, cisgender heterosexual features, such as bravery, physical strength, the ability to protect their families. But this idea of the macho has turned toxic, has turned a negative in the past couple of decades. And that's an interesting turn here where we now see macho and macho more as a person, a man, mainly who uses aggression, who uses exaggerated strength in a negative way to dominate, right? It's a dominant version of masculinity, of cisgender heterosexual masculinity here. So this is a turn to the negative, but I would argue that this is positive. It's positive that we talk about macho populism. It's positive that we talk about hypermasculinity, because these concepts today make visible something that has been invisible over the past centuries. Mostly masculinity usually was the identity category that was undefined. Really, gender in many senses, even today when we think of gender, when we speak about gender, we immediately think about women and femininity. But actually masculinity and all other shades and all other versions of gender also play a role within this concept of gender, right? So the fact that we talk about masculinities is an important thing. It's a good thing for democracy and for deliberative democracy as well. If we look at masculinity studies, the concept of hegemonic masculinity has been very central, right? It's termed by Connell and has spurred a big field, lots of debates about hegemonic masculinities. And this concept of hegemonic masculinities is also mostly used to describe populists. So they are described as hegemonic because this is the version of how masculinities dominate over femininities, dominate over other versions of masculinities. So racialized masculinities, gay, queer masculinities that are dominated by hegemonic masculinities. But the core feature of hegemonic masculinity is that masculinity always remains unmarked. It remains unnoticeable. It remains invisible in the public sphere, right? So we can talk about the marked gender, women, femininity. We can talk about racial marginalized groups, other marginalized groups. We talk about intersectionality, but hegemonic masculinities withdraw from this gaze, from the scrutiny. And that is what the concept of hegemonic masculinity says. And that is also where the power of masculinities come from, right? Because masculinities performed by those who use this kind of expression, it leaves them unmarked and unscrutinized, which gives them a special power position, an unfair position with privileges in society. So that's why I argue that our scrutiny of masculinities, talking about macho populism, about hypermasculinity, is a good thing. And this has changed in the past few decades because masculinities have gone into crisis, right? There's a general talk about the crisis of masculinities, and this crisis is mostly spurred by contestations in the public sphere, by feminist movements, by movements such as Black Lives Matter, such as Me Too, who contest masculinities, but also whiteness from the perspective of racialized movements, and this makes visible this identity category of the white man, which has previously not been scrutinized, not been visible in the public sphere. And this visibility brings with it a kind of accountability that can be imposed here. So now we talk about things like toxic masculinities, right? We scrutinize masculinities. We criticize the use of masculinity as power, which formerly was also used as power, but was unnoticed. We use terms such as mansplaining, right? And that is it's a creative, a creation that makes a lot of sense in our context today. But I think why it is so important is that, I mean, people used to mansplain forever probably, right? But they weren't held to account. Nobody said this is mansplaining because the phenomenon existed, but it didn't have a term, it didn't have a label, it wasn't visible, it wasn't perceptible. And I think mansplaining is also a nice term to talk about because it shows that masculinity is always an identity performance. We're not talking about gender, about sex categories such as men and women here, but we're actually talking about identity performances, so that here we can illustrate that women could be mansplaining as well, right? So we're talking about which kind of identity performances we engage in here. If I have a bit more time, I could go into other versions of masculinities, and then I would ask Ferds for my slides at this point. Of course, there are other versions of masculinities that are relevant for populism today, right? So we talk about macho populism, and it is important to have this kind of scrutiny to visualize, to perceive these kind of masculinities as well. Can we go 2 slides back, please? Yeah, but 1 slide forward, please. Yeah, so here we see like typical populists, macho populists, if you will. And we notice, okay, of course, there's been many jokes about their blonde hair, and it's been seen as something, you know, shrill, they're attention seeking, right? So when we look at that, we easily say, well, they are attention seekers. But I think that's not all to it, right? If they would just want attention, they could go another way. But this is decided, all three of them here, Johnson, Trump, and Wilders, all decided to dye their hair blonde. And so I argue, and have explored this question with my brilliant colleagues, Ricardo Mendonça and Renato Duarte, and we together think that this kind of like dyeing your hair blonde in this instance, as an example, right, is a kind of feminization, right? So the blonde hair color itself is associated with femininity, but also the act that these three men at least here care about their public appearance, and they engage in this kind of like cosmetic procedure is a kind of feminization. And I think this alludes to a kind of queerness in their masculine identity performance, which is just a dimension, right? This is not to say that these men are gay. Queerness is just a dimension of their identity, their masculinities here. So they are not only hyper-masculinities, macho populist masculinities here, but there is a dimension of queerness. So if we go to the next slide, I think in Donald Trump, this becomes particularly visible, especially in his body language, right? This is something that often goes unscrutinized, but in his hand gestures, in the way he treats his hair, in the way he pouts his lips, we can actually see quite a lot of queer body language. For me personally, when I saw Donald Trump speaking, my gaydar went off, right? Without thinking that Donald Trump is gay at all. But the point is that there is a queer dimension to his gender identity performance. And that is something interesting, and that is something important. So there are concepts in masculinity studies that help us make sense of why somebody in a hegemonic position would engage in this kind of queer identity performance in this case. And that is explained through the concept of hybrid masculinities. So hybrid masculinities argue basically that hegemonic masculinities have become so contested, so pushed from diversification, right, from different other identity categories, that they are threatened to lose their hegemonic position, and indeed they are becoming visible. So as they're becoming visible, they engage in a kind of hybridization by borrowing, by actually appropriating, and this is really a form of cultural appropriation, certain aspects, certain components from marginalized identity categories in society. And through this kind of concession, they send, and of course, this is a subconscious process. This is not an intentional strategy here. This is a subconscious process where they communicate to their audience that they are rebellious, that they are different, that they are daring, but also it plays in this case with homosexual desire, with queerness, with maybe the desires of their followers themselves. So if we can just go to the next slide. My dear colleagues, Ricardo Mendonça and Renato Caetano have explored these kind of questions in relation to Bolsonaro here in Brazil. And they build on Judith Butler's work and look at the self-presentation of Bolsonaro and look exactly at aspects like the vulnerability, the intentional performance of vulnerability of this populist leader. So the populist leader, and this is my main point here, doesn't always pose as a strong man, doesn't always perform macho populism, but also borrows other aspects to tell their story, right? They tell stories of vulnerability. They play with sexual desire, with different marginalized identity categories in society. And in my paper, I talk about whiteness masculinities, and I also talk about the Trump movement and how they become visible in the public sphere today. So maybe we can close the slides at this point, and I'll just return to the question of deliberative democracy. So what does deliberative democracy have to offer in response to the challenges of macho populism? Well, I think deliberative democracy is an inherently feminist concept, a feminist ideal, right? It has many feminist components in it because the 1990s discourse of people like Iris Marion Young have pushed for that, but also because the field was very receptive. It was also pushed from the outside, from agonists. And the theory itself, I would argue, has very clear feminist features. So there's this idea of empathetic listening. And we can translate this to a kind of feminist idea of care, right? Caring for each other, listening for each other, versus the populist idea of judging harshly and hierarchically. We have the idea of critical thinking and critical questioning in deliberative democracy. We could tie this to rationality and rational argumentation as well. But I think I prefer the idea of critical thinking versus the simplification that populism usually engages in. And we have the idea of genuine bottom-up participation, which is very strongly pronounced in the feminist movements already starting in the 60s and 70s, versus the idea of strong leadership from the top down. So I think deliberative democracy already offers a lot to challenge macho populism by putting forward a different way of doing democracy. And populists should be open to that because they talk a lot about direct democracy, right? But they imagine a kind of competitive referendum-oriented direct democracy, while deliberative democracy offers a different ideal here. But, and this is my final point, I think deliberative democracy needs to be further developed from the perspective of masculinity studies, because what these feminists successfully did is implementing, championing these kind of feminist ideals, which are based on on female experiences. But what is missing to date, I think, is scrutiny towards masculinities, right? So what role do men and masculinities play in deliberative democracy? So the first appeal is make masculinities visible, right? Let's talk about masculinities and the role they play. And for men, for anybody actually who exhibits, who engages in the kind of masculine identity performances, we can reflect on what this means for ourselves and which roles we take in deliberative processes. And that's my second appeal here at the end, that I think that people engaging in these kind of masculinities need to reflect on their position, need to reflect, and I'm including myself here, obviously, as well, need to reflect on their privileges. This might mean something like shutting up at some point, like stepping back, like handing over the microphone, leaving the stage, and leaving privileges that we are naturalized to have. We've never been given actively privileges, and somebody said, here you go, your privileges, right? But rather we were born into this role, and these privileges have been naturalized. So starting to questioning them can be, and usually I guess is, a painful process, right? And letting go of privileges is even more painful. So I think it's a process that needs scrutiny. I think it's a process that men and women, that is not the question here, have to play an active role in. And yeah, the key, I think, is self-reflection. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hans. And look, I think, unfortunately, our colleague Maria, who is joining us from Argentina, has not been able to connect. So it might just be a conversation between you and I now, Hans, before we throw it perhaps a little earlier open to Q&A with the audience. Look, one thing that I wanted to pick up on and ask for your reflections on, there was a turn of phrase about women mansplaining in your discussion, and that got me thinking about some of the far-right leaders who we might say are inviting masculine populism, but are themselves women. So I'm thinking of Pauline Hanson in Australia, Marine Le Pen in France, Giorgia Meloni in Italy. So I just I would be interested in your reflections on the role of, in this instance, 3 women, far-right populists, in promoting a hyper-masculinist form of populism, which we might think, intuitively is detrimental to them if we look at this from like a gendered perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So I think that, yeah, I think the mansplaining example is a really good one, and I've caught myself thinking about women like, okay, I got the point. You should know that I should know that you should know that I know, right? You can stop mansplaining this to me. And then I was like, whoa, this is strange. There's something strange going on here. I think it just illustrates that it's a performance, and the biological sex doesn't play a role. So I think women populist leaders have a very tricky role to play, and to a certain extent that goes for any female politicians, I guess, because on the one hand they have the well, that goes for right-wing populist leaders in particular, right? They have the right-wing conservative ideology of what the role of women in society should be, and that they should not be in the role to start with, right? They should be in the house and doing this kind of housework, should be mothers. If they're, if they have children, then the idea is that they are neglecting their children. So there's harsher criticism towards right-wing populist women in this regard than, I guess, women from left parties. So they have this kind of ideology, and then there's the idea that women should be feminine, right? So that if you stick to traditional gender roles, then women should not engage in masculinity, right? They should engage in femininity and show feminist traits. And if they are really in a tricky role, because if they show feminine traits, then they're seen as weak, because femininity is in the public sphere mostly seen as weak. But if they exhibit masculine traits, then they engage in gender crossing and are sanctioned for gender crossing, which is always disciplined by public discourse as well. So they have a really tricky role to play. That's also probably one reason why there aren't that many female populist, especially, female populist leaders. But there are successful examples of the recent past. So things seem to be changing here as well. And I wonder whether this could be explained through this idea of hybridization as well in a certain way, right? So maybe that is a concession to public discourse to say that, we have a woman, we're publicly acceptable, we can pursue a right, maybe even right extreme agenda here. And this is more easy to sell, maybe to promote by a woman. Yeah, I'd be interested in Maria's ideas as well. Maybe we'll have a chance to catch up at another point.
Good afternoon. I am María Esperanza Casullo, and first I wanted to briefly define what I would understand as macho populism. It's important, I think, to understand that right-wing populism is fundamentally linked worldwide to the ostentatious performance of a kind of masculinity, in which masculinity is very specifically defined as aggression. So one thing that we find in common with all the different right-wing populist leaders is that they take great pains in building up and then sending into the world and sharing and distributing these images, these performances, in which they try to portray themselves as being very aggressive, with using guns, displaying this kind of very macho posturing, wielding a chainsaw, etc., etc. Of course, there are other ways of defining masculinity, or you can even come to the conclusion that the performance of masculinity is so exaggerated that it ends up becoming a kind of parodic this depiction of masculinity. But nevertheless, this is a very strategic and very detailed performance of masculinity, in which masculinity is, as I said, very specifically constructed as being extremely aggressive all the time. Now, but it's not only being aggressive, it's also being aggressive towards very specific groups. And the main group, which is the victim of this kind of aggression, are feminists, and more in general, women that are portrayed as being insufficient, women that don't know their proper place. But this is not only women, it's also racialized groups, it's also ethnic minorities or ethnic peoples, it's migrants, is people that are usually at the bottom of the social hierarchy. So there's a display, there's a performance of aggression, but it's a performance of aggression that doesn't have a kind of, it's not anti-systemic in a way, it's not subversive of social hierarchies. It's an aggression that it's very specifically aimed at reinforcing that hierarchy. And gender and the display of gender-based aggression is the one common denominator in all the right-wing or macho populism that I study. The images, the fourth image in the bottom right that I'm showing, are all these artificial intelligence-generated images of a popular pop singer and actress in Argentina called Lali Espósito, which just when Javier Milei was elected as president of Argentina, just sent a Twitter saying, how sad, how scary. That's it. That was the whole thing. And the whole media environment and social network environment linked to the President Milei and President Milei himself, month on end, has done this sort of harassment campaign against her. So it's aggression, but it's not just any aggression. It's a very specific aggression that it's aimed towards A, feminists, B, women that do not know their place, and C, LGBTQ people, racialized people, ethnic people, migrants, and also political adversaries in general. Going to the second question, how deliberation can actually counterbalance this, I think it's important to understand or to affirm that that deliberation is constructed, this type of macho populism construct deliberation and even talking as a feminine practice, that it's not masculine, that it's not aggressive, and therefore is of a lower level and should not be encouraged. So what a real man does is acting and acting aggressively. A real man does not talk. A real man does not engage in any type of back and forth of ideas, because that's a feminine activity. That is something that only women do. So in a way, just by participating in deliberations, we kind of affirm the validity of a practice that's fundamentally opposed to this type of macho populism. And I think it's not by chance that feminist thinking is acknowledging the importance that talking has just as a political practice. I'm thinking, for example, of the novel and then the film called Women Talking, and how subversive open spaces for feminine, quote unquote, dialogue can be. I think that the real challenge is to, of course, build up these spaces that, first of all, are not afraid of being called feminine, but of course are inclusive of all sorts of people and perspectives. And I think that there's also another potential, which we know since at least Alexis de Tocqueville, which is this type of staged performances of aggression are much more difficult to take when you're face to face to another with another person. It's easy, or it's easier to click send through a screen and send a mean tweet, these images, but a lot of people would not say these things face to face to Lali Exposito. It creates there's a different accountability when you're discussing face to face these type of things. So I really believe that the number one challenge that we have now in the face of this type of populism is constructing this type of real body face-to-face interactions. Even if we let go of the hope that this type of deliberations are going to bring better forms of public policy or are going to bring better outcomes, they are valuable in and of themselves.
Yes, I hope so. One other thing I just wanted to pick up on from your discussion around what deliberative democracy can do in response to this kind of hypermasculine populism is the point around, I suppose the feminine or feminist coding of deliberative democracy and the sort of care ethic implicit in that. And that is a counter to the sort of polarizing divisiveness of particularly far-right populists. But one thing I'd be interested in your reflections on is that far-right populists would say that actually they care. The problem is, I suppose, they just care for only their people, right? And so it's a very exclusionary form of care. So I just wondered if it's not just care in and of itself, but it's a particular kind of care that is needed and how you maybe envisage that.
Yeah, I guess it's the question of where you draw the boundaries, who you care for. So there's the question of this kind of external exclusion. So who is the demos and who is included in the group that you care for? But then it's also, I think, an internal hierarchy within right-wing movement, right-wing parties that still adhere to traditional gender roles, where hierarchies also play an internal role. So I think the feminist idea of care is a very different one. I think it's an idea of caring for everyone, and that can be extended to all humans, but also beyond that, right? To non-humans, to nature. I think that's a very broad, inclusive conception of care. And that's something else that actually bothers me about that's something else that I would like to talk about, maybe with everyone here. Maybe other people have ideas as well about the concept of populism itself, because populism tries to include left and right populism by basically saying it's an us versus them distinction. There's an in-group and an out-group, and it's the elite versus the people, and that goes for left and right-wing populism, right? But I really think this is very problematic because for left-wing populism, that is right. It's the people versus the elite. But for right-wing populism, it's the people versus the elite and versus immigrants versus people from other countries versus LGBT people versus all kinds of other groups, including women. And that's a bit of a murky category there, of course. But so in the end, right-wing populists are a small group against the large majority versus while left-wing populists are indeed the large majority against the small elite minority. So I have a problem with the idea of populism in itself. I'm also not a populism scholar. I'm a deliberative Democrat, a radical Democrat. So I wonder if anybody else has a take on what should we do with that idea of populism in itself and to what extent it makes sense.